Each week we hear of new temperature records being set.
Some fear we're already witnessing worst-case scenarios.
New climate records being broken.
Why we are not moving any further. 1.5 to stay alive cannot be that mantra.
What those climate records are telling us is that nature and climate are moving far, far faster than we humans are. So we've got to run incredibly hard to try to catch up with nature so we can forestall the worst of the climate crisis. The most famous COP to date was definitely Paris in 2015, because that's where the nations of the world finally agreed a mechanism by which each of them would make their own commitments to solving the climate crisis. Paris was about commitments, but this year was designated as the time for a global stocktake to work out whether countries' commitments were big enough to solve the climate crisis, but more crucially, whether their actual implementation, their progress to date, was on track. We're actually going into COP already knowing the answer because the UN provided it a couple of weeks ago. The answer is that no, the commitments aren't big enough, and progress to date is even further behind what's needed. We've known for decades that fossil fuels are a very critical issue, but the debate now has raged for many years about how we tackle that. This COP is going to be particularly difficult on fossil fuels because the host country is the United Arab Emirates, and the person who is designated president of the negotiations, Sultan Al Jaber, who is the chief executive of the UAE's national oil company, ADNOC. Currently, ADNOC is the 6th largest oil producer in the world and the 7th largest gas producer. But its fossil fuel investment plans will create a massive new legacy of emissions. It is an outlier in this dash for more reserves. The fact that a major fossil fuel producer is host and president of COP has raised concern from a number of other governments that have lodged complaints about the appointment of Sultan Al Jaber as the president. Al Jaber and the UAE have tried to ameliorate these concerns by saying that it's really important for fossil fuels to continue to supply energy as we transition to clean energy. But what they're essentially saying is they want to play the very long game to make the fossil fuels a viable business as long as possible. But that's not what the world needs, what humanity needs to solve the climate crisis. We need a very, very rapid phase down in fossil fuel use. Recently, the International Energy Agency has produced an authoritative report saying that in order to meet our climate targets, the fossil fuel industries have to shift a very large proportion of their capital expenditure away from fossil fuels and into clean energy. The numbers are very big. Right now, they're only investing 1% of their capital expenditures in clean energy. The IEA says they need to make that 50% by 2030. That's a huge, huge shift, a dramatic shift in strategy and focus for the oil, gas and coal companies. And yet, in the face of all this evidence, the global fossil fuel sectors have hardened their position. On one hand, the oil and gas majors have been backing off investment in clean technology, but at the same time, they've been pumping much more investment into acquiring new reserves by some very large takeovers of smaller companies. Even though logically the science tells us those just can't be burnt. Another very big issue on the table at COP is money for developing countries. They need it in two forms: to cope with loss and damage and to cope with their own economic development. Loss and damage refers to two aspects of the climate crisis for developing countries. First of all, the loss of economic activity because of decreased fertility of farms or loss of infrastructure, but also the damage caused by storms and flooding and the like. These, of course, are climate impacts that were not caused by the developing countries themselves, but by climate change caused by developed countries, hence the moral obligation of developed countries to help their developing neighbours. Last year at COP27 in Egypt, the countries of the world agreed in principle for a new funding mechanism for loss and damage. But a year of preparatory meetings on that since has not gone well. The ideas remain very skeletal, and therefore that's going to be a huge and contentious workload for this COP. The other financial aspect for developing countries is massively increasing the investment they need to make sure that their economies develop, but in ways that are clean, i.e. no emissions, but also climate resilient, being able to deal with climate change. Quite rightly, developing countries want the latest technology, and they want to create 21st century economies, not catch up on 20th century economies. The perfect example is how many of those countries just kind of leapfrogged landline telephones and went straight to mobiles, rather than building out old technology landline networks. So that applies across the board, whether it's in terms of using clean energy rather than fossil fuels, and indeed it flows through to how they build houses, how they build roads, how they build all their infrastructure to make sure it's climate resilient and climate compatible. But this requires large money, and inevitably those countries don't have strong credit ratings, and therefore it's a risk to lend large sums of money if you're in the private sector. So that's why the idea of the multilateral investment banks coming in underneath that private sector investment to give some measure of comfort to the private sector investors. Amid the great array of really important issues at COP is the transformation of agriculture around the world. This is terribly important because land use change for agriculture and then farming practices and the food we produce are in aggregate the largest source of greenhouse gases and thus climate change. Great transformations are starting to happen around the world. However, here in New Zealand, the default setting amongst our excellent farmers is that they're already amongst the best in the world, as measured, for example, by relatively low greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of meat or kilogram of milk solids, and therefore it's up to the rest of the world to catch up with them. But this ignores the fact that the rest of the world is exploring very different territories to make sure that agriculture works far better with nature generally. And it would be very exciting to see our farmers lock far more strongly onto these big trends. So I hope to come back from COP with lots of ideas, lots of knowledge from people at COP on these issues. In its recent election campaign, National declared that it would ensure New Zealand met its climate commitments, but it then said it was going to remove a number of the key programs which was helping us make progress on that. So it's a really important challenge for National to work out, now they're in government, what different kinds of programs they're going to install to help us meet those emissions reductions. It'll be my great pleasure and privilege to bring you daily reports from COP for Newsroom, but I'll be bringing you a very particular New Zealand perspective on the issues and reports on how New Zealand delegates at COP are playing their role in this annual Hui of humanity.